So yeah, for those who are going to be watching, this is Pastor Chris, and I'm here with Rabbi Bob Rubin, who is part of the Brick Clergy Ministerium. We have gotten to know each other a little bit, being in meetings together. We recently were at a meeting with the mayor of Brick. But Rabbi Rubin has been sharing with the ministerium just different articles and such since the attacks on Israel on October 7th. And at one point, I just followed up and asked if we could grab coffee, and we did. And I got to just ask him a lot of questions about history, politics, some theology, and the time went too fast. And he offered afterwards if we would ever want him to come share with our church. And since we meet in a school and it's just not too conducive to midweek things. And since we have done podcast videos in the past, I thought, you know what, let's do that. Let's record it, and then it can live on our website for a while, and people can check it out. So that's how we got here. So what should I call you? Rabbi Rubin, Bob, Rabbi Bob?
Any of the above.
All right. Sounds good. I appreciate you being here again.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, can you just start by sharing a little bit about yourself? You are the rabbi for Temple Beth Or and Brick.
Right. I've been there since 2011, been here in 2011. And the synagogue is in transition right now from a previous property to a new property, but congregation is still meeting. And we also share space. Actually, we meet at the St. Thomas Lutheran Church has provided us an office space and use of the gym for services. But
Oh,
we hopefully to be in our new building or refurbished building soon, but it's a process.
yeah.
But Temple Beth Or has been in brick for since the 1960s, and been honored to serve as the rabbi here since, as I said, since 2011.
Yeah, we both forgot this, but I think it was around 2015-ish when we were potentially going to rent from you guys in your old building off Van Zyl. And
Right.
um yeah, we decided not to and to stay at the school, but that was an option, and you guys were very generous to consider that.
Hmm.
But anyway, let's jump in here.
Yeah.
I'm just
Sure.
going to ask a bunch of questions, and we'll just see where it goes.
Okay. I'll try.
So,
I should say my usual disclaimer, as I said, now that we're being recorded, that I'm not a world expert. I try to follow the news closely. I try to see the reality. Of course, uh, part of the Jewish people is to have a feeling for Israel and the state of Israel and the history of the Jewish people and the land of Israel over many centuries and millennia. But at the same time, I don't speak on behalf of the Israeli government or Israel as a whole. It's just my personal opinion from what I've seen, what I've learned over the years.
yeah. Yeah, and yeah, I appreciate you saying that. You had said while we were having coffee that forgive me if I mess this up. Um, but you made a joke about how, people say that Jews conspired to do all these things, and you said you can't get two Jews to agree about anything.
Right.
I feel
There's
like that.
kind of an undercurrent in Jewish tradition to question and to debate. There's even some of that if you look at the stories about Moses being confronted by the people in various points in his career, and wasn't the smoothest of a process. But certainly in later rabbinic tradition, the Talmud and other rabbinic works has many, many disagreements, differences of opinion, and we accept that. And in fact, we cultivate that to some degree. It'd be a whole nother discussion we could have another time. But that applies to the modern political situation as well. There are many opinions within Israel itself. There's a range of opinions, and the general joke is, two Jews, three opinions. But it may apply to other groups too. But we feel it for about ourselves, and it's the challenge is to understand each other's opinion, even if we disagree. So the rabbis, again, in the rabbinic literature over the centuries, have many, many disagreements, but there's a lot of respect.
Mm,
And you can have disagreements with respect, and that's the goal.
Yeah, so it's okay. Like so well, let's start with a little history. For those who aren't aware of the last 100 years, what has happened with the state of Israel? Could you just kind of summarize and take us up to the present day?
Sure,
Who
sure.
owned the land? What happened? A little bit.
Okay, I'll go back somewhat. Obviously, if you go back, thousands of years, you have the biblical stories about the connection of the Israelites, the Jewish people, to the land of Israel. Uh, Eventually conquered by the Babylonians and destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. Eventually coming back uh, when it became the Persian Empire, and then eventually, I mean, this is more than 100 years ago, but but then eventually became part of, but just by being in the land of Israel, it was conquered and reconquered many times by other empires, eventually becoming under the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, and then in the year 70 CE, there was a revolt against the Romans, and the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and there were some subsequent revolts, and a lot of Jews were exiled in a lot of different places, and that's what's called the diaspora. But there was always a desire to return to Zion. Just wasn't the easiest thing to do. And even the Psalms talk about, by the waters of Babylon, we sat and wept and wanted to go back to Zion. So that was kind of spiritual Zionism, and some people made the trek from North Africa, from Spain, from Europe, from Eastern countries, but it was not easy. But there were Jews living in the land of Israel, even under the Roman Empire, later, even after the dispersion, after the Byzantine Empire. Muslims eventually conquered the area in the North Africa as well. So as under Muslim, and the Crusaders came, and the Muslims reconquered after the Crusaders
Now,
after a while.
can I pause you?
So sure,
My understanding is that there were always Jews, even when Muslims ruled the land, even with the change of rulers,
yes.
there was always a remnant, right, in the land.
Yes, there were always Jews living in the land of Israel. Certain cities, were known for Jewish population, like Jerusalem, Tiberias in the north, Hebron in the south, various and other places, and there different empires came and go. And again, just geographically, if you look at a map, Israel is a kind of the crossroads between Egypt and to the southwest, and whatever empire in the northeast was there. And the empires would kind of try to conquer each other, and Israel was always in the way, in the middle, as they went up and down the coastal areas. So after the Muslims reconquered, eventually from the Crusaders, um, and eventually, kind of again, this is an oversimplification of the history over centuries, but eventually became the Ottomans from Turkey conquered the area. So for about 400 years, from the early 1500s to World War One, 1917, that range, the Ottomans were in control of the Palestine, Jordan, what is now Jordan, Israel, Syria, Lebanon. It was just all part of the Ottoman Empire, and that's what brings us to the modern situation. Um, in late 1800s, many people started to think about returning again to Zion, to Jerusalem, to Israel, in a more massive kind of way, more organized kind of way, and had what's called the development of political Zionism to actually try to set up a Jewish presence, an organized political presence, a state in the land of Palestine at the time, in that piece of the Ottoman Empire. Theodor Herzl, seen as one of the founders of modern political Zionism, convened a Zionist Congress in 1897 in Switzerland to try to invite, just Jews from all over the world to come and talk about the possibility of setting up a Jewish state in the
Mm.
land of the Ottoman part of that part of the empire, the eastern part, which was called Palestine. There was no borders like were today, but it was just all part of the Ottoman Empire. So Herzl and the others went to various leaders of the world, like the Ottoman leaders, and said we would like to set up a Jewish state, and they kind of said no. But
Mm.
there were still Jews starting to come back to the land of Israel in more numbers. And there was also a history of anti-Semitism in some of these countries, especially in Europe. And Theodor Herzl said, you know what, maybe we need to leave Europe and return to the land of Israel.
Mm,
So he went to various powers, I think Germany and Britain, and but they all said, well, the Ottomans control that. We can't give it. In fact, the British said we don't control Palestine because the Ottomans do, but the Ottoman Turks, but we do have this place in Africa called Uganda, if you want to go there.
mm,
And it was called the Uganda Plan.
huh.
And Herzl said, well, it's maybe my second choice, but it's better than nothing. And
Yeah.
the Zionist congresses, and then Theodor Herzl started having more Zionist congresses, first Congress, second Congress, every year or so to develop some of these ideas. And the Uganda plan was turned down. They said, no, we want to return to Israel, to Zion, and we'll wait and do our best to make it happen. So this was, again, the beginning of political Zionism. Now, what one of the debates early on was whether there should be, even from the Jewish point of view, a Jewish state or just a Jewish national home, and without the political state, because again, it was a province of the Ottoman Empire. It could be a Jewish national cultural society without actually having its own state.
Hmm.
And others advocated no. This was, in fact, this was a time that many groups were becoming states, and the Jewish people should have a state as well. Now, part of the debate goes on throughout the centuries about whether Judaism is a religion or a nation, a people. It's actually both,
Right.
which is another discussion we could have another time. But it's both a religion, and it's also a sense of Jewish peoplehood. So the Jewish peoplehood, the religion, you might say, doesn't need a state. It's good. There's religions all over the world don't have states, but a peoplehood would tend to be more comfortable in their own state, even if there are minorities there too. That's fine, but the majority Jewish culture would also be a majority Jewish state. What
And
eventually happened was World War One.
mhm,
Now getting into the 20th century, World War One happened, and the Ottomans sided with Germany in World War One, and the British and the French were fighting Germany in World War One, and the Americans eventually got involved too. But basically, so when the when the Ottoman German side lost World War One, the British and the French, who had come into uh, Palestine and other areas to defeat the Ottomans and Germans, um, had the post-war dividing up of the territories that they conquered, and the League of Nations was formed after World War One, and the uh, the decisions were made to give the British and the French mandates over parts of the Ottoman Empire. The French were given mandates over what is now basically Lebanon and Syria. The British were given mandates over what is now Jordan, Israel, and Iraq. Um, and again, these countries didn't exist as separate countries yet, although they all had ancient roots as well. I mean, Lebanon, these are all countries that go back to biblical times too.
yeah.
So, so the what is now Jordan, Israel, and Iraq were under the British, and then there was an ongoing debate whether you could appeal to the British to have a Jewish state. Uh, and in 1917, which is in the middle of World War One, the British did issue a declaration called the Balfour Declaration, saying that the British government supported the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Um, and again, this area was called Palestine. That goes back to Roman times. It was named Palestine. But the British supported the Jewish national home, and of course with the rights of the minorities as well. So based on that, that picked up momentum in the Jewish world, and more Jews tried to come to Israel, to Palestine. Um, Also, the anti-Semitism was growing in Europe. Eventually, the Nazis rose to power in Germany, and it became even more severe. And also in Russia, there were the various pogroms in the 20th century against the Jewish communities. So more and more people wanted to leave where they were and come to Israel. and uh, the Zionist movement grew, and the Arab rejectionism grew as well, and there were various battles and tensions, and
Now,
eventually became a triangle between the British, the Arabs, and the Jews, and that became a difficult triangle to maintain.
and so this is right before World War II. You've
Hmm.
got
So there were Arabs that were more cooperationist with the Jews and the Zionists, and there were Arabs who were less, more rejectionist of Jewish immigration. They didn't want any more Jews to come. Now, one of the claims today is that they claim the Jewish people are colonialists coming from Europe and other countries taking over Palestine. But it's important to note that there were European countries that were colonial oriented. They went over all over the world and had colonies, British, French, Portugal, Spain. Take the history of the world. There's lots of countries that had a lot of colonies. But the Jews that were coming back to Palestine, to Israel, were not doing so on behalf of some home country back in Europe.
right.
They weren't coming to exploit the resources and send it back to Europe. They were coming as refugees coming home to biblical Israel. And that's a big distinction that a lot of people don't think about. But basically, as the anti-Semitism was growing, I mean, there was again a lot of problems in Russia. That's the whole part of Russian history, and under the czars, and then under the communists. Certainly in Germany in the 1930s under the Nazis, um, and so the need for a Jewish state, a Jewish refuge, as well as biblical Israel. Biblical Israel has been there for centuries. But the second component was second motivator was a refuge for Jews from anywhere around the world to come and be home, so to come home. And in the 1930s, there was not a Jewish state; it was still under the British. And by 1939, it really became a crisis in the sense that World War II started.
Right.
And now the British were fighting Germany and the Nazis, um, and Jews in Palestine wanted a Jewish state, but they were under the British. So some of them began to struggle with the British in Palestine. So you had this triangle, as I mentioned, between the Jews, the Arabs, and the British. The British were trying to rule the area, but the Jews and the Arabs were having disagreements about, what kind of rule should take place. But to fight the British in the midst of World War II would be aiding the Nazis,
Right.
even though in Palestine, to give them trouble in Palestine diverts resources away from the fight against the Nazis in Europe.
Hmm.
So the British wanted to placate the Arabs as well. So they were trying to limit Jewish immigration into Palestine. These stories like the ship the Exodus and others that came actually after World War II, but still, but during the World War II itself, uh, Jews tried to escape as best they could, and the British were trying to limit Jewish immigration into Palestine to placate the Arab rejectionism, but at the same time allowed some Jewish immigration into Palestine to placate the Jewish community.
Mm.
And David Ben-Gurion famously said something like, well, the British had issued a white paper limiting immigration, but I think it was maybe allowing 100,000 people a year. But of course, there was a massive need for more than that. And David Ben-Gurion, who eventually became the first prime minister of Israel, at this point he wasn't, he was just part of the leader of the Zionist movement, said that we'll fight the British as if there's no World War II, and we'll fight with the British, uh, because of World War II.
Mm.
So we'll take if they're giving us 100,000 visas a year, we'll take them. We need more.
Yeah.
We'll smuggle people in around the British, behind the British, and as I said, we'll fight the white paper, which is limiting Jewish immigration, as if there's no war, and we'll fight the war as if there's no white paper.
Mm.
Um, it's a good example of kind of, again, Jewish multiple opinions trying to hold both ends at the same time.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
during World War II, in fact, the Jews of Palestine even offered to volunteer with the British to fight in Europe. And they were the British were hesitant at the beginning, but eventually, I think by 1944, formed a Jewish brigade of Jews from Palestine who went to Europe to fight with the British. even as the Jewish community in Palestine was struggling against the British. Uh, so when World War II ended in 1945, and Britain, took quite a beating in the war as well as the other allies, the British finally said, you know what, we give up. We don't want this mandate anymore. We'll turn it over to the new United Nations that was just being formed, and you figure out and what to do. And even under the British, there are various commissions and various attempts to figure out what to do, and maybe divide the land between the Jews and the Arabs, and there are different uh, proposals. And so basically, by 1947, again, the British ruled for a few more years, but they were trying to get out of their mandate. And the United Nations voted in November of 1947, November 29, in fact, the famous UN resolution. It's called 181, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Um, it's called the Partition Plan. And they divide, and one could look up the map from November 29 of 1947, the United Nations Partition Plan. And it was to divide Palestine. But at this point, Jordan had been separated out, and Lebanon and Syria under the French had been separated out. So they were all becoming independent states around the same time. And so the partition plan for Palestine, which was from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which of course is an important issue for today when they say from the river to the sea, that's the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. The United Nations partition plan of November 29, 1947, I encourage everyone to check that out. You look at a map, was meant to have a Jewish state and an Arab state within those, within the land of Palestine. Jerusalem was supposed to be internationalized in some kind of way, which never really happened, but it was meant to be internationalized. And if you look at a map, the border is kind of strange, but the United Nations eventually approved this partition plan based on pretty much where the Jews were living, where the Arabs were living, and this was meant to be a partition, a compromise between the Jews and the Arabs. Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Is that pretty accurate then?
That's it, right? So you have the thank you. You have the Arab state in yellow. This is a proposed Arab state in yellow. And you'll see it's a good part of the northern part of Israel, the Galilee, and even today, that's a lot of Arabs live in the Galilee. The West Bank, what was now called the West Bank of the Jordan River, and if you look in the lower left, the Gaza Strip. Well, again, it wasn't Gaza Strip at that time, but the Gaza area, and a piece of the Negev. If you go a little lower, that was the Arab state, and that was basically where the majority Arab populations were. The Jewish state is kind of orange or brownish.
Yeah.
You had the coastal areas, Tel Aviv, along the coast, and up to Haifa. You had the Negev Desert, Beersheba, and the Negev Desert. Eilat is at the very bottom. I don't know how far the map goes down, but there you go. At the very tip is the bottom is Eilat, and then you had the northern Galilee area on the eastern side, connected to the Sea of Galilee, where you have Tiberias and Jewish, again, higher Jewish population.
Mm-hmm.
You see that Jerusalem is white, a little circle. It says UN administration.
Mm.
So Jerusalem was supposed to be an internationalized city. Again, it never happened. It never materialized, but that was the plan. That Jerusalem would be a mixed city and under United Nations administration.
Mm.
And that's the partition plan. And that's crucial for a lot of people don't think of this today, but the whole idea of two states from the river to the sea, a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, what happened is the Zionist movement, the Jewish leaders said, well, the borders are unusual, but we'll take it
Mm.
because it's a Jewish state. And this is, by the way, even without Jerusalem being the capital. This was a big debate. How can we accept a country without Jerusalem being the capital? Go
And
back to
so,
biblical times.
right. And can I just pause you real quick?
Sure.
How would this two-state, how would it have been run? Like there,
Oh, okay. Good question. You see, they're kind of crossing points so that between the top yellow and the middle yellow and the lower left of the yellow, there'd be a crossing point where
yes,
it's very narrow.
right,
And the
little,
same thing with the brown areas. There'd be,
yeah.
those would be crossing points, so that the idea was there would be two governments, two states, each one with three sections, basically, and each one with crossing points. And the hope was that people would get along and work it out.
Got
So
it.
this was the partition plan, again, creating a Arab Palestinian state as well as a Jewish Israeli state in the land of Palestine from the river to the sea.
Got it.
But now, again, this is crucial for understanding the situation today because we don't come in a vacuum. This is out of history. Again, the Jewish leaders said, well, it's not everything we wanted, but it's a Jewish state, and that's what we want, and we'll accept this partition plan. The Arab rejectionists said no. Now again, there might have been some Arab cooperationists, but they're in minority. And the Arab leadership was rejectionist and said, no, we don't accept this partition plan. They voted against it, but they were outvoted at the UN, so it passed the General Assembly. So um, um, what could Israel do? So in the next 6 months, the British mandate was ending in May of 1948. That was the plan. And the Jewish leaders had to decide, which was a very crucial decision. Do we declare a state anyway, even if the Arabs don't accept it? Or do we try to work out a peace agreement with the Arabs and then create a state? So
Yeah.
there's some debate about whether we should work out a peace agreement first and then create the state second. And other people said, you know what, we could end up waiting forever.
Hmm.
And so by May of 1948, the British were leaving because that was the plan, from November to May, they had 6 months to leave basically. And as the British were leaving in May of 1948, um, the Jewish leaders decided to declare a state. And that was on May 14th, 1948. On May 15th, six Arab armies invaded the Jewish state. And you can see from the surrounding countries that now, so those borders of the partition plan never materialized. Um, it just didn't happen. That was the plan, but it just didn't come into reality. And so six Arab armies invaded the Jewish population, and
So, so that's
from
some Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt.
yeah, Egypt, right? And again, I think there were contributing troops from other
Got
neighboring
it.
countries, but those are the Iraq and I guess maybe Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken. So they attack, and the War of Independence breaks out. Now, again, there were skirmishes even leading up to that, but
Right.
this was the major war. So basically, the view of the Arab countries surrounding Israel was let's push the Jews into the sea. Right? Let's destroy this Jewish state, the Jewish people,
Hmm.
and and then in the course of the war, which went on for about a year, from 1948 to 1949, um, there were battles back and forth, and each side won some and lost some. But eventually, and the Jews were outnumbered. You talk about the armies that were attacking were actually full military, trained armies, and the Jews had slowly built up somewhat of an army, but it was obviously outnumbered, outgunned. Many stories about how how they survived, but you take a look at the overall picture, it was a kind of a miracle. And the Jewish tradition says we don't rely on miracles, but we certainly celebrate them when they happen.
Hmm.
And so this was quite a miraculous holding off against all these Arab armies until 1949, and eventually, like in many recent battles, the UN came in to negotiate a ceasefire, to broker a ceasefire, and so then you had the the 1949 borders. I don't know if you have a map of that.
Yeah.
After the War of Independence. So you see, the yellow is where. So basically, in the War of Independence from 1948 to 1949, um, the territories changed from the partition plan.
Yeah.
But when the ceasefire was finally finalized in 1949, the Jews were in control of what is now the yellow, light yellow. The Jordanian army was control of was now, we call the West Bank, Samaria and Judea there, right? Egypt was in control of what is now called the Gaza Strip, right, on the left side, on the west side.
Okay.
And this, it's important for everyone to know that these were never officially borders because there were never any peace treaties. This was just a ceasefire line from the UN just to get the fighting to stop.
Okay.
And all sides at least agreed to the ceasefire. So these borders became state of Israel. Uh, Egypt was in this Gaza, so Egypt was ruling Gaza from 1949 to 1967. We'll come to the Six Day War in a moment. Jordan was ruling the West Bank. Um, Now, interestingly enough, because of the partition plan, these were not sanctioned occupations. So, in a sense, Jordan occupied the West Bank, uh, and just like Egypt occupied Gaza, of course, Israel is being accused of occupying these areas because of the later war. But
Mm.
the these because this was just the ceasefire lines from 1949, but they became functional boundaries, and the Israel state of Israel moved on, and the Arab countries had to move on also. Now the map doesn't show it because it's small, but Jerusalem itself was split during
Right.
the
Yeah.
ceasefire lines, right? So the old city of Jerusalem, plus a piece of what's now called East Jerusalem, was under Jordanian rule, and West Jerusalem was under Israeli rule. So you would need a map of Jerusalem itself to show that. But basically, the old city and the Arab section around it was under Jordan. In fact, I had a friend told me once that he went to Israel in 1964, and he was in Jerusalem, and the border was literally across the street. He was on one part of the street, and the Jordanian soldiers were across the street, and he was going to take their camera, and the Jordanian soldier kind of waved his finger, don't take my picture.
Mm.
So we're talking about literally a fence in kind of like Berlin was split, basically the same idea. East Berlin, West Berlin, with just a fence, a wall in between. So that's how close the contact was. But the ceasefire held. Now, another aspect which is a big issue today, of course, is Arab refugees. In the midst of 1948-49 War of Independence, it's a war zone, and a lot of people fled. The Arabs, many stayed and many fled. There are different ideas, interpretations of why they fled. Some say they fled because, some historians will say that the Arabs fled the Palestine area and moved to the surrounding Arab countries to escape war. It's a war zone. Some people just pick up and leave. Others say that the Israelis kicked them out. They expelled them from certain Arab villages. And others say that the Arab leaders said, "Come on out from Palestine. You can return to your homes in a few weeks on the backs of the victorious Arab armies
Mm.
after we kicked the Jews into the sea." So probably it was a combination of all three. Some left because it was a war zone. Some left because they felt the Arab leaders were encouraging them to leave and then come back, shortly thereafter. And in some instances, the Jewish militias and may have, taken over Arab villages and towns and expelled the residents. So
At this point, the Arabs were outnumbered by the Jewish people within the state of Israel.
that's an interesting question. I don't know the exact numbers. But it did depend where. So the totality is hard. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it depended where. There were certain cities that were more predominantly Jewish. Certain cities were more predominantly Arab. I'll give you one quick example. Jaffa, Jaffa in Hebrew, Jaffa is a very ancient city. The book of Jonah, right, talks about the prophet going
Right.
to Jaffa and getting a ship, to escape God's, request to go to Nineveh, which is in the other direction. But so Jaffa is a very ancient city, very, thousands of years old, an ancient port. Tel Aviv was a Jewish suburb of Jaffa when it was found in the early 20th century as kind of a Jewish area.
Yeah.
Tel Aviv, of course, has grown to be one of the biggest cities in Israel, if not the biggest. And now it's a Tel Aviv Jaffa kind of municipality. So Jaffa was the Arab city, Tel Aviv became the Jewish city. So it depended really where people lived. And even in Israel today, which is a whole nother discussion, we could have a discussion of Israel today versus history. There's a lot of separate living. It's just the way Israel
Right.
works. There's Christian areas, Muslim areas, Jewish areas, Druze areas, Druze villages, Christian villages, and of course Jewish areas. Just they tend. There are some mixed areas on purpose. And then neighborhoods or building developments that are kind of built to be mixed neighborhoods on purpose. But just the way Israel is, a lot of people live in their own little uh, neighborhood or town or village, and so it really depended where you were in the land of Israel. So again, the those borders from 1949, became functional. Again, I shouldn't call them border; they're the armistice lines, ceasefire lines, but they became functional. And Israel wanted Jerusalem to be the capital, and so West Jerusalem became the capital of Israel, and East Jerusalem was under the Jordanians. But by 1967, Arab nationalism was rising again, and uh, Nasser in Egypt, the leader of Egypt, was stirring up a lot of trouble to kind of once and for all defeat Israel, and again throw the Jews into the sea. And the lead up into
Now, can I ask a
May.
question that
Sure, go
just
ahead.
make a
Sure.
distinction here? Were they looking to take the state away from the Jewish people, or were they looking to get Jewish people completely out of the area?
That's a good question. It depended on who. Uh, there were some of both. Um,
From the government of Egypt standpoint.
right, right, right. It's a little bit of both because
Okay.
from a Muslim point of view, and again, I'm not a Muslim spokesperson for sure, but from a Muslim point of view, in a Muslim country, the Muslims are, primary first-class citizens.
Yeah.
Jews and Christians were tolerated as second-class citizens. Pagans were in trouble. Idol worshiping pagans. So the Muslims conquered various countries and had this class of citizenship called dhimmi, which was a second class citizen, but protected. So Jews and Christians were allowed to live in Muslim countries if they accepted the second class citizenship. So, it's half empty, half full. It's second class, but it's protected.
Right. Right.
So for many centuries, the the rub for many Muslims was that Jews and Christians were not to have sovereignty in a Muslim area. So, for example, from the Christian point of view, when the Crusaders came from Europe and conquered Palestine from the Muslims, um, it took a while, but Saladin and other Muslim leaders fought back. And it's one thing to live as a Christian or as a Jew in a Muslim country; it's another thing to have sovereignty. So the Crusaders had Christian sovereignty, and the Muslims fought back eventually and conquered the Crusaders. And so when Israel came in, when Israel established a state in 1948, it now became Jewish sovereignty. And so from an Islamic point of view, that was a problem. Now, again, there were other Arabs who were, there were Arab Christians as well, and Arab Muslims. There were some Arabs who were cooperationists and said, well, we'll work it out and we'll just live next to each other as neighbors. And there were many Arab rejections. Um, so by leading up to the 1967 war, I think there's probably a combination of both. Let's defeat the Jewish state and also kick the Jews out as well. Make them a minority. One of the things Egypt did, I'm sorry, Egypt did in 1967 in the spring was to close the Straits of Tiran. Not too different from what the Houthis and the Iranians are trying to do as well. To interfere with Israeli shipping, even though it's an international waterway. So So that was actually considered an act of war, even though it was international water, but they were blocking Israeli ships, from entering the Red Sea in order to get to Eilat, which is an Israeli port. And so basically the Arab countries were threatening Israel once again with destruction. And there was even a talk of an international coalition to break the blockade, and somewhat like the international coalition now against the Houthis. But that international coalition to break that blockade did not happen. So Egypt Jordan, Syria, maybe to some degree Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, were once again threatening to attack Israel. Um, and Israel felt under attack, even though it had not been attacked yet, except for skirmishes. Even to the point where they were, by May and June of 1967, especially in May, I guess, to prepare for what they thought might be coming is this another Arab invasion, just like from 1948, that they were already digging mass graves to get ready.
Mass graves for themselves?
Yeah, for
Oh, wow.
themselves, because they were afraid that, these were again major Arab armies. Now,
Right.
Israel's army had developed somewhat from 1947, 48 to 1967. One quick example, in the War of Independence in 1948, as I mentioned earlier, Israel being outgunned and outnumbered, Israel had no air force. They had four propeller planes, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and that was the Air Force. um, Obviously, by 1967, Israel had developed a lot of defense industry because they knew they had to. So that's another whole history we could look at. But fascinating, and the four airplanes I think they had in 1947, 48, 49. They the best they can do is drop something out of the cockpit.
Hmm.
I'm talking about these small propeller planes. It's just the whole history of the beginning of the Israeli Air Force. But anyway, so by 1967, Israel had developed a defense Israel Defense Forces. That's the IDF that's often referred to, Israel Defense Force, and they realized that they had to do something, or else they were going to get attacked again by this massive Arab force. There were clearly threats on the borders. Egypt had broken again the Sinai Agreement. Egyptian troops were on the border. Syrian troops were ready. They convinced Jordan to get involved too. And remember, we were talking about the city of Jerusalem being split down the street. So Jordan and Israel were literally across the street from each other. So, in 1967, beginning of June, Israel felt that in order to survive, they had to preempt and attack first. And that started what was called the Six-Day War because it only lasted 6 days. They
Hmm.
didn't know that at the beginning, but so in June of 1967, Israel had a plan in which they executed, um, basically attacking the Egyptian Air Force while it was still on the ground. They basically surprised Egypt. But now they say, well, Israel attacked first, but you have to look at the context of what was leading up to this to realize that Israel considered this a war of defense because of the literal threats and again the blocking of the Straits of Tehran, we considered a war crime, act of war that is, and you have to look at and there are various documentaries about this. You could look and see. I mean, Egypt calling for the destruction of Israel. I mean, the Arab armies calling for the destruction of Israel, mounting troops on the border. So Israel attacked first and knocked out the Egyptian Air Force pretty much on the ground, and ruining, destroying their planes, and so within a day or so gained air superiority, which is of course a big help. And then even though the war ensued, um, the Israelis had the advantage of going first, as an act of defense, and that's crucial because in the course of the Six-Day War, Israel conquered Gaza Strip and Sinai from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights in the north from Syria. And so then perhaps have a map of the post Six-Day War,
Yeah.
um, and that created a whole new reality for everyone on the ground. Um, but again, within 6 days, Israel was able to push off the Egyptian front, push off Jordanians from Jerusalem, as well as the West Bank, and capture the old city of Jerusalem. From the Israeli point of view, they are reuniting East and West Jerusalem into one city once again, just like again the example of Berlin being unified into one city instead of having two halves. Um, and the Golan Heights from this Golan Heights before, Syria could shoot into the Galilee, into the kibbutzim and the farmers. because they had the advantage of the heights. So Israel conquered the Golan Heights. Again, all of this within 6 days. So
Mm.
again, we don't rely on miracles, but we certainly celebrate them. So there you have the yellow and the brown together was now post 1967,
Right.
right? So now keep in mind, remember, the Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt. They never incorporated it into Egypt because they weren't looking to have Gaza as part of Egypt.
Okay.
But from 1949 to 1967, Egypt administered that. Jordan administered the West Bank. As I said, Syria had the Golan Heights. After the Six-Day War, Israel controlled all of this. And now the question is what to do. Israel was not looking necessarily to control all of this, but in the course of the war, they had to defend themselves. Here, at the very bottom, that white circle is the Straits of Tiran that I mentioned earlier. All right, so that's what Egypt blocked from Israeli shipping from getting to Eilat, which is the southern tip of the Yellow. Um, so Israel had a predicament at this point. What do we do with all this territory? Well, they're glad to get Jerusalem back. That's kind of a given. To reunite East and West Jerusalem into one city. The old city of Jerusalem with the Temple Mount was now in Israeli hands. So that's kind of a historic, reconquering going back to, ancient times.
Yeah.
The Golan Heights was strategic because it overlooked the Galilee from the heights down to the valley. And the Sinai was a good buffer against Egypt. Now you have a whole significant, Sinai Peninsula. Don't forget, Sinai is mostly desert and not a flat desert either. Mountainous ranges, Mount Sinai somewhere in Sinai, from what we understand. Even though our traditions, we don't know exactly which mountain it was, but Sinai Peninsula only has several passes through it for any kind of army or military. So Sinai was a major buffer against Egypt, for any future attack, and it goes even up to the Suez Canal, which of course is very important for Egypt. So Israel to decide what to do, and actually offered what was now eventually called land for peace. Right? If you, the Arab countries, will make a peace treaty with us, we'll give you back territory, and and this was debated. Some said no, we needed strategic depth. We saw what it was like to be next door across the street from the Arab armies. That wasn't working out too well. And so we need to have strategic depth, and we should not give back these territories. We may or may not incorporate them in Israel, but we'll just administer them as buffers. The Arab League met in September of 1967, so only a few months after the war, after this reality sank in. They issued a statement. The Arab League, which were representing all these Arab countries, issued a statement to Israel: no peace, no recognition, no peace, no recognition, and no acceptance. I forget what the third term was. It became known as the three no's,
Mm.
right? No peace, no recognition, and no acknowledgement of, no acceptance of, the situation. What was Israel to do? So they held on to these territories, right? Um, and they tried to administer them. So now the West Bank was under Israeli control. They never quite incorporated they incorporated Jerusalem into Israel and next to the city of Jerusalem.
So, Bob, can I
If you-
pause you for a
yeah,
second?
go ahead, sure.
Just for a second time, I want to get to the like kind of the the current situation is could we do like I don't know, more of a flyover from 67 to
Sure,
current?
sure.
Is that
Well,
possible?
basically, the war in between was the Yom Kippur War in
73.
1973,
Yeah.
and that was significant in the sense that Egypt and Syria surprised Israel, attacking it on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which of course is seen as some was a precedent for the Hamas's attack, which was on a Jewish holiday as well, as in the Sabbath, as well as a Jewish holiday. But in 1973, Egypt, some say Israel got a little too complacent, and with the strategic depth that they had, even though they were willing to give back land, they got a little too complacent. And Egypt and Syria surprised Israel with an attack on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, in 1973. Jordan, interestingly, stayed out of that battle. They did not participate in the Yom Kippur War, and that was significant. So Egypt did break into Sinai, and Israel and Syria broke into the Golan Heights,
Mm,
and the Yom Kippur War lasted several weeks. And Israel was able to push back major losses because they were caught by surprise, just like they were caught by surprise by Hamas. And but they eventually pushed Egypt back, and even crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt, which pushed shockwaves into Egypt. But the Egyptian army was still in Sinai, and so again, a UN ceasefire was worked out in 1973, and eventually the Egyptian troops went back to Egypt, the Syrian troops went back to Syria, and Israel reestablished its control of the Sinai and the Golan Heights. And then eventually, uh, um, President Sadat became, the leader of Egypt. And interestingly enough, a few years later, by 1978, um, Sadat said to Israel, "You know what? Let's make peace,"
mm,
which was a major breakthrough. And Egypt came forward. Sadat came to Jerusalem, spoke to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and this was a major breakthrough. Even though Sadat was in charge of Egypt at the time of the Yom Kippur War, after several years later, he was convinced that peace was the way to go.
mm,
And so Egypt and Israel did work out a peace treaty with the help of the United States, and signed a peace treaty in 1979, if I'm not mistaken. So it's held for all these years. Um, Part of the peace treaty was to give back the Sinai to Egypt. But interestingly enough, Egypt did not want Gaza, and that's significant. So even though Israel had occupied Sinai and Gaza, and Egypt had occupied Sinai and Gaza previously, Egypt said, "We want Egypt back, but we don't want Gaza. Gaza was not part of Egypt." So even after the peace treaty with Egypt, Gaza was left in Israeli hands. And that's, of course, crucial for today to understand what's going on today. There's a border between Gaza and Egypt, just like there's a border between Egypt and Gaza and Israel. And that's very significant for today because the Rafah, southern Gaza town, that's the last holdout of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, is the border with Egypt, and so Egypt plays a role here too. So that's after so Egypt makes peace with Israel by the 1990s. What's called the Oslo Accords. Israel makes gestures to the Palestinians to set up some kind of Palestinian Authority, which is what's in the West Bank today. Therefore, then Jordan can come in forward, and I think it was 1994, if I'm not mistaken, makes a peace treaty with Israel and gives up claims for the West Bank. Jordan says, "Okay, we don't want the West Bank anymore. We had it at one time, but, we're giving up our rights to that." And Israel eventually annexed the Golan Heights as part of Israel because they never worked out a peace treaty with Syria, and the Golan Heights were up in the mountains overlooking the northern Israel and Galilee, and was seen as too significant to give back. So, just for a security point of view. So that brings us pretty much to the situation today, where from the 1990s on, the Palestinian Authority was to set up rule in Gaza and the West Bank. And the hope was among the cooperationists that it would eventually lead to a peaceful Palestinian state. Um, Yasser Arafat was the leader of the Palestinians at the time, a former terrorist, and the hope was that maybe he would turn into a peacemaker. He and two Israeli leaders, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, the three of them together won the Nobel Peace Prize, for working this out.
mm.
So the hope was, maybe this would lead, the terrorists would turn to peacemakers and be good neighbors. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And Yasser Arafat and other Palestinians still encourage terrorism. There were other terrorist groups within the Palestinian community, and the rejectionism came out once again. And they still talk about two states for two peoples, the Oslo process, being the model. and that's still an issue today. Whether that can happen or not, that's basically the burning issue in Israeli politics. Can we really trust the other side to have two states for two peoples? And what kind of Palestinian state would it be? Would it be demilitarized? Who's going to enforce that? Um, uh, some say it's worth a try. Some say it's a suicide pact. You can't just set up a, a Palestinian state. Look what happened when we did it. And look what happened when Hamas took over in Gaza. So again, I appreciate the opportunity. I've done a lot of speaking today, but one other component is the internal rivalry within the Palestinian community between Gaza and the West Bank. Um, the Palestinian Authority has authority in the West Bank. Originally, it was the West Bank and Gaza, but Hamas, as its own rejectionist terrorist organization that does want to destroy the state of Israel and does want to kill all the Jews, um, eventually kicked out the Palestinian Authority from Gaza. And in 2005, 2006, basically took over. There was one election back then, and there hasn't been an election since. Um, Abbas, the current president of the Palestinian Authority, was elected back in, I think it was 2005. But it's been said that he's in the 19th year of a 4-year term because there haven't been any elections since. And again, the Palestinian Authority was literally kicked out of Gaza by Hamas, by a rival Palestinian faction. And since that time, Israel was still in control of Gaza, but Israel chose to withdraw. And so Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005, allowing for the election to take place. And so this whole notion of occupation is really a sad misrepresentation of the reality on the ground. Um, Various, authorities have occupied and reoccupied and unoccupied these areas back and forth.
Yeah,
Um, but so Hamas takes over in Gaza, Palestinian authorities left in the West Bank. Any talk of a Palestinian state always hinges on them getting back together again.
right.
It's supposed to be one Palestinian state. Question is, that question of, I guess, uh, connectedness. How would the two territories be connected into one state? And that's been discussed off and on. Maybe a
And
tunnel.
Israelites will disagree on a two-state, one-state solution. Like they'll go back and forth and debate what's the best solution here.
Yes, within Israel itself, which is a whole discussion by itself, there's a wide, even among the Jewish population of Israel, there's a wide divergence of ideas. Um, some hold out for the called the two-state solution, two-state plan. Question is what kind of Palestinian state can be trusted not to be militarized and attack Israel once again. And others say that it's just not a real option. It's just we'll have to figure out some other model. Some talk about a three states, maybe Gaza by itself, West Bank by itself, Israel by itself.
Mm.
I wrote a paper once called the 12-state solution. That's another discussion for another time.
Yeah, wow.
Um, I said the United States has 50 states. Maybe there would be one country with 12 states. Divide up all the little sections.
Huh.
But that's just it was a kind of a model. But who knows? Who knows what would happen? Nothing. The other thing I think people should know today is it's not going to happen until both sides agree. So even today, with America, especially with the campus protests, um, and that certainly brings us to literally this week,
Yeah.
um, um, it, calls for a ceasefire are very well intentioned. But two things: you can call for a ceasefire all you want, but until Hamas as well as Israel agree to it, uh, America can't impose it. You
Right.
cannot impose a ceasefire until
Right.
both sides agree. So that's what happened in 1949 and the other wars, and even the Hamas battles over the years with Israel, each one ending in a ceasefire of some sort. There was a ceasefire in place up till October 7th, October 6th. October 7th was, again, a surprise attack by Hamas. I'm sure your congregants are familiar with what happened.
Yeah.
Um, so that Israel is fighting back. What they see is a war of defense to fight Hamas once and for all, because they've had many battles with Hamas over the years. A couple weeks long, a few weeks long, rockets back and forth. But this was a land invasion land, air, and sea invasion by Hamas. Thousands of fighters coming in. There's actual invasion, and Israel's fighting back. That kind of militarily. Um, their their war is against Hamas, not against the Palestinian civilians. Unfortunately, the civilians are caught in the middle.
Right.
Um, Even the reports of 30,000 plus casualties in Gaza, which is tragic. Um, People don't realize that probably almost half of them are Hamas fighters, which don't get reported separately. Hamas is not interested in you know being honest in its figures. At the same time, it is a tragedy. Hamas could end this war tomorrow by just returning all the hostages and surrendering, and the war would be over. So, and even the peace
Mm.
treat, there've been various negotiations for hostage releases over weeks and months. I often wonder how long can they sit and talk to each other over and over and over and over again.
Right, right,
But you
right.
have to keep the talks going. But Hamas, basically wants Israel to surrender, and Israel says no. And Israel says we want our hostages back, and we want Hamas out of Gaza. Even their plans, even to have Hamas leave Gaza, even if they left Gaza and went somewhere else, that might be an interim agreement, but they haven't agreed to that either.
Right.
So it's a question of Israel feels it's a question of survival. Keep in mind that Hamas has vowed publicly to do the October 7th attack again and again and again, if to given the opportunity. So uh, uh, President Abbas and Fatah in the West Bank is officially is open to a two-state solution, living two states side by side with Israel. Hamas definitely is not, and so and it's hard to know again what the two-state solution would look like when Hamas is so rejectionist. Um, and unfortunately, so that's one aspect of
Now,
the
can you?
campus protest. The camp. Let
Yeah,
me just one other thing. The
sure.
campus protests calling for a ceasefire when the parties to the ceasefire aren't agreeing to that. The second, and then of course they'll blame the current administration of the United States for not bringing about a ceasefire. But we don't have a magic wand to impose a ceasefire. The second is calling for a ceasefire in humanitarian terms. Sounds good on paper, but why can't they also call for the release of hostages at the same time? That is very perplexing to Israelis. That they're calling for a ceasefire, presumably that means Israel. But what about Hamas? Hamas is supposed to cease fire too, and Hamas still shoots at Israelis. Hamas still shoots rockets into Israel occasionally, although they aren't as many as they did before. But they still even during this battle, they'll shoot rockets occasionally into Israel, into civilian areas, and they still hold about 130 plus hostages. Some alive, some dead, unfortunately. And all these campus protests and the other protests calling for ceasefire and can't bring themselves to call for a humanitarian release of hostages. And keep in mind, the Hamas has not even allowed a list of hostages to be given. Israel still doesn't have an official list of who's hostage. They can only do it by guessing, who might still be alive, who's missing, who they've seen on videos, taken by Hamas. So Hamas has never let the Red Cross visit the hostages, never released a list even of the names of the hostages they have. Uh, didn't allow. There was an attempt to get medicine into the hostages. We don't think that ever reached them because the medicines were found with Israeli names on them in various other places. So. If Hamas wants to cease fire, they need to say yes, and they're not saying yes apparently. So these demonstrations, I mean, the right to protest is fine. You can express your opinion, but you don't have the right to harass other people and attack other people, like Jewish students on campus, just because they're Jewish. Um, and But even in being pro-Palestinian, you can be pro-Palestinian and still be pro-Israeli too.
Right.
There are cooperationists on both sides. There are various organizations. There are many, many organizations that are cooperations oriented, even with names like Combatants for Peace. And, as one example, I mean, the former combatants who want peace. So it's a question of the will on both sides to live as neighbors with each other. And
Yeah, and that I feel like that's what a lot of people don't know, that there are, as you put it, cooperationists on both sides. I mean, a lot of the people who were actually killed were the ones living close to Gaza who were actually trying to build the bridge with the
right,
Palestinians.
it turned out, of course, Hamas attacked to what was next to it, next to the Gaza Strip, and there were a lot of Israeli kibbutzim there. And as it turned out, again, Israelis have a lot of different views, but these were Israelis who were willing to live up to and next to the Gaza border, which even before October 7th was subject to rocket attack. Cities like Sderot, kibbutzim like Be'eri and others that you hear about in the news, they were living up next to the Gaza border. Some of them were participating in Gaza Israeli border crossings. Workers would come from Gaza to work in these communities. Uh, People came from Gaza for medical help in Israel, and some of these communities had members who, you know, transported them, from the Gaza checkpoint into an Israeli hospital. Um, so there were cooperations at work, and a lot of these communities, just by virtue of their willingness to live next to Gaza, were at least cooperations oriented. But Hamas didn't care. Hamas didn't care. In fact, Hamas murdered non-Jews too. I mean, and captured them. I think they're still in captivity. People from 18 different countries
Hmm.
in captivity in Gaza, not all Jewish. And they finally issued a joint statement. The U.S. and the other 17, a joint statement demanding the release of hostages. Now, I don't know what took the other countries so long to come around, but at least they finally did. But the question is, what kind of pressure to put on Hamas to make this happen? Hamas is the one holding the hostages,
Right.
and now, again, there are political diversity within Israel, so no question about it. There are some who even want to reoccupy Gaza and kick the Arabs out, but that's a minority. Minority. Some of them are in the government, but it's a minority part of the Israeli government. Um, we could have another discussion sometimes on how the Israeli politics works and the
Yeah,
different
there's so much to
parties.
talk about. I'd like to get
Yeah,
into even like the overlap of theology and what the different beliefs about the Messiah. Um,
yeah,
there's so much. But just a couple more quick questions about
sure.
situation with Hamas. If I may play devil's advocate for a moment, I'm not a military expert. I'm not a war crimes expert. But what do you say to the accusation that Israel is committing war crimes with the reckless, with the accusation that they're, recklessly bombing and not considering how many civilians they're killing.
Right. It's a fair question. And of course, the International Criminal Court was meeting on that very topic. Um, but we make a distinction based on intention, and it's a big difference. Hamas attacked Israel with the intention of killing civilians and
Mm,
capturing them as captives and
right,
hostages. That was their plan. The rocket fire from Gaza constantly is attacking civilian areas. Those rockets are not aimed at particular. They can't aim them anyway. They're not that sophisticated, but they're still powerful and lethal. So they'll just shoot rockets at Tel Aviv or shoot rockets at Israeli cities. Just see what it hits. Fortunately, Israel's developed a lot of defense, layers like Iron Dome, for example. Another topic for another time. But um, so the intention is to kill civilians and destroy Israel. Israel, in self-defense, has to fight back. You know. Now, in previous wars with Hamas, it was limited to incursions, a week here, 2 weeks here. There have been various battles with Hamas over the last 19 years. Usually rocket fire against and then counterattacks. Israel would see where the rockets were coming from and try to attack the rocket launchers. Because remember, they're right next to each other, Gaza and Israel, right next to each other. And now with drones in the air, they can keep an eye on everything. But the rocket launchers would be placed in mosques and hospitals and schools, and so Hamas just like Hezbollah does in Lebanon. But so Hamas would put the rocket launchers specifically in supposedly safe areas, and that would give a challenge to Israel to counterattack. And Hamas, we think, wants Israel to counterattack in civilian areas so that so the civilians are caught in the crossfire, but they're also caught by Hamas's plans. And all these tunnels that you hear about, these major, major concrete reinforced tunnels that Hamas is in, they don't allow the civilians in. Those are not tunnels for the Gazan civilians. They're tunnels for Hamas. And some go, I heard one report that one tunnel system is 7 floors down. And these are concrete reinforced tunnels. All the billions of dollars that came into Gaza for reconstruction was taken by Hamas, and they built
Yeah.
these major tunnels. So Israel is fighting back. It's an urban warfare. It's tragic. It's terrible. Um, Hamas could have surrendered on day 2, and given back the hostages, and Israel would not have had to attack. So, unfortunately, Israel is fighting back. Civilians are caught, and Israel tries as best as can. It's made some mistakes. The world essential kitchen workers that were killed by mistake, the aid workers. Israel's even killed some of its own hostages by mistake. There were 3 hostages that were got out of the captive hands of the captors, the Hamas captors, and Israel saw them on the street and thought they were terrorists, and they killed
Huh.
3 of their own hostages,
Yeah.
which was
Yeah.
a terrible mistake. So, and the recent couple weeks ago, I just heard on the news again that there was a tragic attack, and some kids in a street in a play, basically playing in the street, were attacked. That area was attacked, and 10 kids were killed. And these are terrible tragedies and terrible mistakes. Um, but the overall goal of the war is to defeat Hamas, who attacked Israel in the first place. And again, keeping in mind that Hamas has said they'll do it again. So it's not like, okay, in past attacks with Hamas, after 2, 3 weeks, Israel say, well, we destroyed some of its infrastructure, we destroyed some of its rocket, capabilities, and we'll pull out, and we'll go back to the way it was. Uh, Israel this time says we can't do that. It's literally an existential threat. And
Right. Yeah. And so,
and by the way, this last battle for Rafah in the south that you hear so much on the news, Israel knows there's a million Palestinian civilians there because they asked them to flee the other areas. Because keep in mind, uh, even in this urban warfare, the reason there's so many civilians now in the southern tip of Gaza, because Israel asked them to leave the other areas so they could fight Hamas without them being in the way. And how many other armies do that? Sadly and tragically, if Israel really wanted to do genocide, which they don't, but if they wanted to do genocide in Gaza, they could have just come in and just mowed the whole place down, and just bombed it to smithereens and killed everybody, and or they could have, which they didn't, and they didn't want to. They could have come into the Gaza streets and just machine gunned everybody they saw, which they didn't want to, and they didn't do that. That's what Hamas did. Hamas invaded Israel and just shot everybody they saw. So that's genocide. That's the attempt to destroy a people. What Israel is doing is, there are civilian casualties, and it's sad and tragic, and it's terrible. But Israel is fighting a military battle against a military force called Hamas.
Mm.
And unfortunately, the battleground are the civilian areas, because Gaza is mostly a civilian area. So so Israel is not committing genocide, in our opinion. Uh, Now you might say, well, people die. It's terrible how they die, which one way or the other way. But so as I said before, it's based on intention and goals. And Israel would be very happy not to have to do this war in the first place.
Right.
And the crazy conspiracy ideas, I don't even like to call them conspiracy theories because it makes them sound too legitimate. But crazy ideas like Israel carried out the October 7th attack because they wanted to conquer Gaza or something. It's ridiculous. October 6th, things were very peaceful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And October 7th, they weren't. So, and all the footage that you see was Hamas taking the film, the videos of what they were doing, and they posted it online. They were proud of what they were doing. That's a big distinction as well. The the terrorists not only attack and murder, rape, and mutilate, they celebrate it. And Israel, in counterattacking, is not doing any of that. They are People are being killed in the process, but sadly, but they're not raping, and they're not pillaging, and they're not beheading, and they're not mutilating people. They're not committing genocide.
Yeah.
And they're sad over the losses, the civilian losses, and they're trying, as best they can to avoid that. So even at the risk of Israeli soldiers, risking their lives. The
Yeah.
hospital situations, I should at least briefly mention the hospital situations. The early hospital that was attacked, the Palestinians, Hamas claimed right away, an Israeli rocket, hit a hospital and killed 500 Palestinians.
Yeah, I remember.
It turned out to be a Palestinian rocket, not an Israeli rocket, and it hit the parking lot, and probably dozens of people were killed, but not 500. And it was, like I said, it was a Palestinian rocket, not an Israeli
Right.
rocket. And the
Right.
late,
That was confirmed
more,
by the American government as well, right?
uh, what's that?
I said that was confirmed by the American
Yes,
government as
yes,
well, right?
confirmed. Yeah, confirmed
Yeah.
by the American government. Al Jazeera even confirmed. Um, the Arab news media eventually, confirmed it. The more recent hospital where Israel had a battle in a hospital for a couple weeks. Yes, hospitals are supposed to be safe zones, but the reason that Israel went to battle there was because about 800 Palestinian Hamas fighters took up positions in the hospital, which of course is a violation as well. So the question is, who's committing war crimes here?
Right. Right.
And so Israel caught hundreds of, arrested hundreds of Palestinian Hamas fighters in the hospital, and killed a number of hundreds as well. So if Hamas is putting their civilians at risk, you know, how do you stop that? Hamas has to stop doing that.
Yeah. For Jews living in America, Jews who are also American citizens, what is the mindset? What is the opinion about whether or not America should be doing more, whether they should be more involved? Is there a consensus? Is it just varying opinions?
Well, there are always varying opinions, but the question is, to do more means what? What do you do more? I think there's a sense that the American administration is trying to do what it can. It's trying to balance, uh, you know, Israel's right to defend itself, which includes fighting Hamas and giving weapons to Israel so it can defend itself against Hamas, and at the same time supporting the Palestinian civilians through humanitarian aid, and encouraging Israel not to overdo it, so to speak, to be more and more careful as best as it can
Yeah.
to not hurt the civilians. America has sent this, they're building this port off of Gaza in order to, um, with Israeli security, so that aid can come in by sea, more efficiently. Uh, America's worked with Israel to open more border crossings so that more trucks can come in with humanitarian aid. Now, within Israel itself, some lean toward the defeating Hamas being more important. Some lean toward getting the hostages back being more important, even if Hamas is still there. That's a big discussion within Israel itself, back and forth, protests all the time. uh, Now, you mentioned, though, it should be reinforced that Israel is a democracy compared to the Arab neighboring states, and it makes a big difference, in the way Israel functions, and American support for Israel. So, but you can disagree with policies or decisions of the Israeli government and still be in support of Israel as a whole and Israel's right to self-defend itself in its self-defense.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I got so many more questions, but we'll have to do another one if you don't mind.
sure. Thank you
Um,
again for the opportunity. I know I
oh
did a lot of the talking, but
yeah, our church is praying. Our church has been praying for Hamas to be stopped, for hostages to be released, for civilian casualties to stop. How all those things can get accomplished is way beyond
yeah,
my pay grade.
right.
Um,
Mine too.
but
But we can discuss it, and that's important. And encourage your congregants to dialogue and discuss and learn other points of view, even if we don't agree with them. It's still
yeah,
important to learn what the other side is saying and thinking,
yeah.
and that's important too. You know.
Yeah, so next time I'd like to talk about more like the culture of Israel, some of the stuff you shared with me when we had coffee about the way,
Sure.
the local courts are set up for Muslims, for Christians, for Jews, and some of the different theologies within the Orthodox community. So we'll if you don't mind, we'll schedule another one. We'll
Abs-
we'll get into
Be
it.
happy, absolutely willing to do that. Sure, that'd be
All right,
great.
cool. Cool, Rabbi Rubin.
No,
I really appreciate it. God bless you.
you
Uh
too.
we are praying. So thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity to keep up the prayers.